One would think that after the dismal reception of the new adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the cancellation of the Flintstones, Hanna-Barbera would have folded over. But by this point in their tenure, they were already solidified in the television animation industry. In other words, this would be a minor setback for them. For instance, they would actually take another shot at primetime television with another animated sitcom, Where's Huddles? This one was only just a temporary replacement considering the show wouldn't go past 10 episodes. After that, their output on network primetime ceased. But little did American audiences know there would be a new renaissance waiting for them to take on. By 1969, Hanna-Barbera had chosen to put most of their manpower into the Saturday morning cartoon market. This would be a time where the major networks were clamoring to have a successful cartoon show, considering the success that theatrical shorts had found again on television. A lot of studios would start putting their hat in the ring, and the Saturday morning cartoon programming train was underway. Hanna-Barbera was no different. See, despite the output of animated primetime programming and syndicated cartoons, Hanna-Barbera were already in that Saturday morning space. They had managed to churn out marginal successes such as the Adam Ant Secret Squirrel Show, the Magilla Gorilla Show, the Peter Potamus Show, and the very obscure Sinbad Jr. and His Magic Belt between 1963 and 1965. But these cartoons were mostly first run syndication and were never the successes that the Quick Draw McGraw Show and the Huckleberry Hound Show were. As for the network output, it seemed that after the new adventures of Huckleberry Finn's abysmal reception, Hanna-Barbera were down and out. But little did the audience know they were conjuring up a new cartoon around the time they were doing Huckleberry Finn. This time, they would take their services to CBS, who was trying to claim the number one spot in the Saturday morning cartoon space. Hanna-Barbera would dedicate all of their commitment on the network. On September 14th, 1968, Hanna-Barbera would debut Wacky Races on CBS.
And now here they are, the most daredevil group of daffy drivers to ever whirl their wheels in the Wacky Races, competing for the title of the world's wackiest.
This cartoon was right up Hanna-Barbera's alley. In other words, tons of hijinks and antics. It was as the title implied. The cartoon was about a bunch of races that featured an assortment of racers that used wacky tactics while racing across the United States. The cast was quite colorful, including the likes of Peter Perfect, the Ant Hill Mob, Professor Pat Pending, the Slag Brothers, and the show's true villains, Dirk Dastardly and Muttley, who always tried to sabotage the other races to win, but would ultimately fail. Also, there was Penelope Pitstop, who would get her very own spin-off with The Perils of Penelope Pitstop the following year, which featured the Ant Hill Mob, and the premise was that in every episode, Penelope's guardian, Sylvester Sneakley, attempted to claim Penelope's inheritance for himself by disguising himself as the Hooded Claw to carry out his nefarious deeds. These two cartoon series would also mark the full-fledged writing debut of Joseph Ruby and Kenneth Spears. CBS was thoroughly happy with the reception these two cartoons had gotten. But on September 13th, 1969, Ruby and Spears would introduce us to a cartoon that would change everything for them.
Where are you? We got some work to do now.
Lo and behold, CBS would introduce us to Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Just like Hanna-Barbera would take inspiration from shows and sitcoms of the time, Ruby and Spears would do the same thing for Scooby-Doo. This one would be inspired by the many loves of Dobie Gillis and murder mysteries as well. The cartoon is about four teenagers who travel around in a van called the Mystery Machine, trying to solve mysteries. Now, when these kids went to school instead of hanging out at night is beyond my comprehension. Anyway, the cast of the cartoon was quite interesting. First, you had Velma Dinkley, a freckled, glasses-wearing teenage girl with a love for the color orange, it seems, and a knack for being really keen. She was really the detective of the bunch. She tended to solve the mystery a great majority of the time, to say the least. In other words, she was the brains of the operation. Then we had Fred, who was basically the leader and wore an ascot. He would always conjure up a plan to catch the bad guy. Oh, I should mention that the show actually had a spooky vibe, but it was very lighthearted. In fact, the original title for the show was supposed to be called Who's Scared? Anyway, even though the show would present every villain as a ghost, most of the time they were people in disguises, except for the one episode where it was actually a robot. Okay, next we have Daphne, who wore purple excessively and basically hung out with the gang and helped them in some sort of way. Whenever she wasn't in danger, that is. Yeah, Daphne was very danger prone. And she was also the fashionista of the group, to say the least. Then we have Shaggy, who was basically a beatnik who wore brown bell bottoms and a green shirt. What an, interesting color scheme, to say the least. Shaggy was definitely inspired by Bob Denver's character Maynard on The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, but turned up to 10. Shaggy was basically there for comic relief, as he was always scared to even do the job. But when food was involved, he was ready to go in action. In fact, in every episode, he was always hungry. Let's see. He wore brown and green and always hungry. Look, I won't open that can of worms. But let's just say that this was the late 60s going on into the 70s. And leave it at that. At least being voiced by Casey Kasem lent some credibility to the character, right? Besides, Shaggy was always there for his friends when it counted, despite his fears. And finally, we have our titular star of the show, Scooby-Doo. Scooby was quite interesting. This isn't like this is the first time Hanna-Barbera made an anamorphic dog as a main character. That's already been established by this point. And it wouldn't be their last as well, as I will get into much later. Anyway, Scooby was definitely an evolution to something like Astro. Yes, Scooby also spoke with a speech impediment. But unlike Astro, Scooby wasn't the most courageous. In fact, that was the trait that made him special. Scooby was always afraid of what was presented to him. But somehow, he would always catch the bad guys. And just like Shaggy, was always hungry for some reason.
How do you like that? He didn't even invite me.
They would always get him to carry on with a plan that Fred conjured up with dog treats called Scooby Snacks. Told you, this dog was special. Had snacks named after him. If that's not special, then I don't know what is. This would be a running gag in the cartoon as well. The reception to Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Was excellent, to say the least. Parents loved it. The executives definitely liked it, since it kept the parents at bay due to the regulations that were brought upon children's programming around that time. In other words, this definitely wasn't Johnny Quest in any way. Not even close. Instead, it was a fun cartoon that had so much charm. The kids watching it loved Scooby Doo Where Are You? It would only last 2 seasons on CBS initially, but it languished in syndication as reruns into the next decade. That wouldn't be the end for Scooby Doo, not in the slightest, but I will get into that a little later. Let's say that Scooby Doo Where Are You would be a start of a beautiful relationship with the realm of animation. In fact, the success of Scooby Doo Where Are You would catapult Hanna-Barbera into the 1970s with grand fashion. How? Well, let's get this out of the way. Hanna-Barbera in the 70s would be the pinnacle of Saturday morning programming. Just picture this in your mind. Let's say you have a large box of pizza. Now, let's take 3 slices out of that box. You see these 3 slices? These were the other studios that were putting out cartoons at that time. The rest of that pie was Hanna-Barbera. So to say they completely ran the gamut would be severely understated. They were Saturday morning cartoon programming. First of all, by this time, Hanna-Barbera had put much of their primetime cartoons on Saturday mornings, including Johnny Quest, the Flintstones, and the Jetsons. Even the new adventures of Huckleberry Finn would come back to Saturday mornings, but as segments on another show created by Hanna-Barbera called Banana Splits. This was Hanna-Barbera's answer to The Muppets. It was a live action show about a musical band that played music and got into hijinks, of course. Also, Hanna-Barbera would dig into their bag to create something new. For instance, Pebbles and Bam Bam from the Flintstones would get their own show on September 11th, 1971 called The Pebbles and Bam Bam Show, of course. This time, they were introduced as teenagers in high school, and the show would carry that early 70s aesthetic just like Flintstones had with the 60s. The title of the show also had significance to it. See, Pebbles and Bam Bam were an item in this iteration and would form a rock band called the Bedrock Rockers. Say that 5 times fast. Okay. Since this was a spinoff of the Flintstones, Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty would make guest appearances on it, but Pebbles and Bam Bam were always the focal point of the show. It would also keep a trait that the primetime cartoons Hanna-Barbera did, the laugh track. Next, they would take what they did with Scooby-Doo Where Are You and give kids a new cartoon to watch called Josie and the Pussycats. Before I touch into it, there's something to be known. See, Scooby-Doo Where Are You was originally supposed to be about a bunch of kids who traveled in a van and played music, but the music aspect didn't work for the concept at the time. Hanna-Barbera decided that they wanted to take this idea and try to make something out of it. The success of Scooby-Doo Where Are You allowed them to do just that. To achieve this, they would once again look to source material. Josie and the Pussycats were Archie Comics characters created by Dan DiCarlo and Richard Goldwater. The cartoon was about a girl trio rock band who got into hijinks and adventures while trying to play music gigs around the world and trying to overcome the various schemes set about upon them by Alexandria Cabot. You had Valerie Brown, who was, by the way, the very first African American character in a Saturday morning cartoon. She played the tambourine and provided backup vocals in the band, wrote the songs, and was quite the intelligent student to say the least. Now that's representation. Then you had Melody Valentine, who was the blonde of the group. In other words, she was the trope, immature and ditzy. She was even voiced by a Charlie's Angel, the one and only Cheryl Ladd herself. Well, technically, it was Jackie Joseph, but it was Cheryl who actually provided her singing chops. So at least she had something going for her, and being the drummer of the group certainly helped things. And then you had the titular character herself, Josie McCoy, who, of course, was the lead vocalist and guitarist. She was the calm and composed one. She would also be voiced by Janet Waldo, who previously provided the vocals for Joey Jetson years prior and Penelope Pitstop as well. She would be one of the go-to actresses for Hanna-Barbera at this time. Casey Kasem would also provide the voice of their manager and Alexandria's brother, Alexander Cabot III. Josie and the Pussycats was Hanna-Barbera's attempt to cater to a younger audience. Unfortunately, it would only become a marginal success. It would never get past that one season, but in rerun syndication, they would gain a sizable following. Enough to warrant a sequel series of sorts by the name of Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space in 1972. So, in terms of cartoon programming is concerned, all was well. Hanna-Barbera kept the cartoon train rolling in 1972 onto 1973. This time they would bring us Genie, which was a spin-off of sorts to I Dream of Genie. Well, it was loosely based to a point where if you were to put them side by side, you wouldn't have been able to tell they were cut from the same cloth. But that didn't matter because it was catered to a younger audience than the sitcom was. In fact, Barbara Eden wouldn't even reprise her role in the cartoon. Instead, the voice duties went to Julie McWhirter, who also would go on to voice a character from a Hanna-Barbera cartoon that would become their biggest hit to date. That one will come up in due time. Also, this would mark the debut of Mark Hamill's first time as a voice actor. Yes, Luke Skywalker himself, the man who would go on to voice Joker in the iconic Batman the Animated Series 18 years from this point. Here, though, he voices the main character Corey Anders, a high school student who uncovers a magical bottle that housed Genie and her assistant Babu. See, no real relation to I Dream of Genie. Unfortunately, this was not a well-received cartoon at the time, and it would only play new episodes periodically from 1973 to 1975. This wouldn't stop Hanna-Barbera's venture in the slightest because on September 9th, 1972, Scooby-Doo would make his return to Saturday morning in grand fashion.
Hey, Scooby! Scooby, Scooby-Doo, looking for you. Scooby, Scooby-Doo, where I...
Here it is, the new Scooby-Doo movies. See, by the time this series would appear, Scooby-Doo had already become a huge commodity. He adorned lunchboxes, t-shirts, coloring books, comic books, and even vinyl records that served as audiobooks before the concept even ever existed. In other words, Scooby-Doo was officially the mascot of Hanna-Barbera. The flagship character and one that was very loved by many kids through its rerun tenure. So a new series had to capitalize off that, and the new Scooby-Doo movies sure did. It definitely upped the ante. First off, the movie's moniker in the title wasn't there for show. See, this cartoon would introduce a format unheard of at the time. The show aired for 1 hour. To my knowledge, this is the first cartoon that ever employed this format. Okay, technically they weren't movies per se, but they would use another angle to make sure it lived up to the title they were claiming. To play up to the theme of the show, they would also employ famous guest stars. During its run, various stars of the day would make guest appearances such as Jonathan Winters, Sonny and Cher, Davy Jones, and Don Knotts. They even used the Addams Family and the Three Stooges as well. But the most odd guest appearance of them all was Batman and Robin. That alone solidified Scooby's status as a commodity. Hanna-Barbera really meant serious business here. They had managed to make that collaboration work. By the way, we will actually get to Batman and Robin again quite shortly. In all, Hanna-Barbera would produce 2 seasons of the new Scooby-Doo movies for 24 episodes on CBS. Speaking of that time frame, Hanna-Barbera Productions would also take their services back to ABC around 1973-74. There, they would continue their cartoon overpour, starting with this. I told you it would be shortly. Here it is, the Super Friends. This outing would be quite ambitious for Hanna-Barbera. They were in comic book territory now, preferably DC Comics. Comic books were very popular with kids and teens alike, so ABC wanted to capitalize on that, so they seeked out Hanna-Barbera to create a cartoon based on superheroes. This was due to them finding success with Batman and Robin's appearance on the aforementioned of the new Scooby-Doo movies. Now, for this outing, they would recruit Alex Toth. Who is Alex Toth? Well, let me explain. See, Hanna-Barbera had dabbled with superheroes 7 years prior with their own creation called Space Ghost, which would have the distinction of being the first superhero created specifically for television. Alex Toth designed that character and created the show alongside Hanna-Barbera. But Alex wasn't estranged to comic books at all. In fact, he had worked for Dell Comics on works such as Colt 45 and the Flying Ace Range Rider. His works for DC would begin around the 1940s, drawing some of the most important comics of the Golden Age, such as All-Star Comics, The Brave and the Bold, and by this time with Hanna-Barbera Detective Comics. So having him aboard for Super Friends was a wise choice for Hanna-Barbera. They set out to make a cartoon that was kid-friendly, to make it as non-violent as it could be. This was a tall order for Hanna-Barbera considering comic books were very loose when it came to violence. Fortunately, the characters they decided to base the show on weren't as violent during that time. The show would center around the Super Friends, which was basically Hanna-Barbera's version of the Justice League of America, fighting against evil forces and saving the day. Typical superhero stuff of the day, fighting supervillains and the like. Unfortunately, it would only last 1 season. But Super Friends was a special case. Let's get this out of the way. Something would happen along the way since Super Friends' initial run. A slew of superhero shows would begin to appear on TV and gain success, such as The $6 Million Man in 1974, Wonder Woman in 1975, and even Marvel's Golden Boy got in on the action as Spider-Man got his own show in 1977. These shows inspired Hanna-Barbera to give it another shot with all-new Super Friends Hour.
Gathered together from the cosmic reaches of the universe, here in this great hall of justice, are the most powerful forces of good ever assembled. Superman.
In this iteration, the 2 previous teens and their dog would be replaced by 3 new characters. The Wonder Twins, Zan and Jana, and their pet monkey, Gleek. Whereas the original teens were human, the Wonder Twins were extraterrestrial beings that possessed special powers upon bumping their fists with each other. Zan could transform into various forms of water, while Jana could transform into any animal. In addition to these new characters and the original roster, Hanna-Barbera still managed to squeeze in other DC heroes such as Hawkman, Hawkgirl, and Green Arrow. Also, they introduced different ethnic superheroes into the fold as well. Heroes such as Samurai, Apache Chief, and Black Vulcan made their debut here. This definitely please their wide audience. Representation at the forefront before it was even a thing. The Super Friends would go through many iterations up to 1986. Hanna-Barbera would also go on to introduce audiences to a brand new cartoon in 1974 called
Who is this superhero? Sarge? No. Rosemary, the telephone operator? No. Henry, the mild-mannered janitor? Could be.
Hong Kong Phooey on ABC. Around this time, the Kung Fu craze had swept America entirely. Dozens upon dozens of Kung Fu cinema were being released in small movie venues across the country. But it would be Bruce Lee's 1973 martial art epic, Enter the Dragon, that would really set things in motion and legitimize Asian cinema in America. It would go on to earn $350 million at the box office, so it's easy to say that the reception to this movie was a huge deal at the time, and everybody wanted a piece of that pie, including Hanna-Barbera. For this outing, they would enlist the late great Scatman Carruthers to voice the title character. Prior to this gig, he actually voiced another character for Hanna-Barbera. The character Meadowlark Lemon on the animated adaptation of the Harlem Globetrotters on CBS in 1970 for 2 seasons. One of the earliest outings on the network from Hanna-Barbera Productions, so he definitely wasn't a stranger to animated cartoons. Hong Kong Phooey was definitely an odd one. In this cartoon, it starred an anamorphic dog by the name of Penry Pooch, who worked at a police precinct as a janitor. Told you it was an odd one. Anyway, when trouble brewed, he would spring into action by jumping into a file cabinet and changing into Hong Kong Phooey. He was definitely interesting. Hong Kong Phooey even had his own vehicle called the Phooey Mobile to dispense justice to criminals with his sidekick, a cat named Spot, who ended up saving him from a lot of jams. Yeah, Hong Kong Phooey wasn't exactly the most competent hero. He was quite the bumbler, but that was a part of his charm. In fact, he only had a yellow belt in his martial art, but he would consult his manual, the Hong Kong Book of Kung Fu, to disastrous results. The cartoon was definitely typical Hanna-Barbera material, and it played off the Kung Fu craze very well, but the cartoon was definitely Hanna-Barbera material, and it played off the Kung Fu craze, but in a way that only Hanna-Barbera could do. Unfortunately, Hong Kong Phooey would only last a season. Don't worry, this wasn't the last of Hong Kong Phooey, as we will see shortly. By 1975, Fred Silverman would end up leaving CBS, and guess where he would go? ABC, of course, to head up their programming department. The first project he greenlit on the network? None other than a Scooby-Doo series, of course. On September 11th, 1976, the Scooby-Doo show would make its debut on its new home, ABC. This series went back to the original 30-minute format and introduced a new character by the name of Scooby-Dum. He was a very dim-witted version of Scooby-Doo and a cousin to Scooby as well. The show also had more of an emphasis on Scooby-Doo and Scooby-Dum, but the gang was still there solving mysteries as well. The animation was definitely a step above the new Scooby-Doo movies as well. In all, the Scooby-Doo show would last 3 seasons on ABC and produce 40 episodes in total. But there's something else that needs to be mentioned. See, during its initial run, the Scooby-Doo show was originally grouped with another show called Dynamite, Dog of Wonder, and it was dubbed the Scooby-Doo Dynamite Hour. Dynamite was very different from Scooby-Doo. First off, Dynamite was a mechanical dog, And even though he was a little bit of a bumbler, he held his own alongside his partner, Blue Falcon, who technically was the superhero of the show. He was an art dealer by day and crime-fighting superhero by night. The two shows would cross over on a few occasions. In fact, they did on a premiere episode. Scooby-Doo and the gang helped them solve a crime. On top of Hanna-Barbera's two offerings, audiences would also get another Scooby-Doo cartoon of sorts as well.
The Yogi Yahooies, the Scooby-Doo Movies, and the really rotten ones. The players are on the field, in the stadium even, so let's get on with it! Laugh Olympics!
See, this would be a 2-hour block built around Scooby-Doo. This one was called Laugh Olympics, and it would premiere on September 10th, 1977. The cartoons introduced to this block were Laugh Olympics, which was Hanna-Barbera's cartoon take on the Olympics, and would have various characters from Hanna-Barbera's catalog competing with each other in various events, including Scooby-Doo, of course, Dynamite, and Hong Kong Phooey. Yeah, Hong Kong Phooey was back. And he would join them as a part of the Scooby-Doobies. There were also newly made characters called the Rottens as well. This was a smorgasbord of Hanna-Barbera's best. Also, audiences got Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels, which would borrow from Charlie's Angels and Scooby-Doo, as it was about a group of teenage girls that thawed out caveman and they solved crimes. Seemed like ABC and Hanna-Barbera were on a roll around this time. But that was far from the truth. See, the ratings for the Scooby-Doo show and its various incarnations had started to slump. It's a known fact that around this time, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You, and the new Scooby-Doo movies were heavily rotated in syndication. So it was most likely that kids had more than enough of Scooby-Doo for the week. In fact, this reason almost got the Scooby-Doo show canceled on the network. This would cause Fred Silverman to leave ABC for NBC in 1978. Oh, we haven't seen the last of him. Not by a long shot. Anyway, Hanna-Barbera would make another Scooby-Doo series, and things would change drastically. Here is ABC's next Scooby-Doo offering, Scooby-Doo and Scrappy Doo. It would make its premiere on September 22nd, 1979. As the title of the show suggests, we are introduced to a brand new character to the Scooby-Doo series. Gone was Scooby-Dum from the Scooby-Doo show, and in his place, the pie-sized, tenacious pup himself, Scrappy Doo. Scrappy Doo was Scooby-Doo's nephew, who was Ruby Doo's son, by the way, and he was quite the Spitfire. Scrappy Doo was definitely the polar opposite of Scooby-Doo. See, Scrappy had a knack for trying to get into scuffles and running into danger, while Scooby and Shaggy tried to get him and themselves out of the situation by any means possible. Besides the addition of Scrappy, the show also changed an element that was a staple of the show, the villains. On a few occasions, Scooby, Scrappy, and the gang would encounter real monsters and ghosts. Another change was the infrequent appearances of Velma, Daphne, and Fred. The show almost entirely focused on Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy. This change had worked because Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo put the show back in the ratings race again. Hanna-Barbera would prosper in the 70s with a massive output, but there would be tribulations they would have to face going into the 1980s. But this is where they would stumble upon a creation that would carry them to the top of the animation space. As the 1980s rolled around, Hanna-Barbera was still in the race, but unfortunately, being ahead of the pack would not last long for them. See, many studios would start coming in to create their own Saturday morning programming for the big three networks. This also would be a time where the syndicated cartoons were gaining full steam by airing on weekdays. For instance, studios like Geek Entertainment would come with cartoons such as Inspector Gadget in 1983 and The Littles as well in the same year for the syndicated market and ABC respectively. Also, Ken Spears and Joseph Ruby would finally come into their own around this time with their own company, Ruby Spears Productions. They would start gaining real traction in the animation space with Dundar the Barbarian and ultimately the company's biggest success to date, Alvin and the Chipmunks. We will touch on Ruby and Spears even more in a future episode. Anyway, the point that I'm getting to is that Hanna-Barbera would start to have a lot of competition around this time, and with competition comes pressure to create the best product. Into the 80s, Hanna-Barbera would continue their output with Scooby-Doo and Scrappy Doo. Wait, didn't I mention the show already? Of course I did, but let me explain better. See, this would be the second iteration, also titled Scooby-Doo and Scrappy Doo. Hanna-Barbera decided to take the show in another direction this time around. Now, the episodes were split into 3 segments, and the emphasis would be centered more on Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy Doo than ever. The rest of the gang were non-existent in this iteration. The direction of the show leaned more on smaller plot lines that involved Scooby, Shaggy, and Scrappy in various situations. This would be the first Scooby-Doo series to not employ the laugh track, by the way. By this time, TV had drastically changed. This wasn't due to how cartoons would soon be marketed as. The direction of cartoons would start to go towards merchandising. This is something we will touch upon in another episode entirely. But let's just say that in the 80s, it would be the start of a lot of changes in the world of animation. Hanna-Barbera rolled on along though. NBC would be a major stomping ground for them at the start of the 80s. They would dig into their bag of creative properties with the Flintstones comedy show, which had several segments housing the Flintstones characters, including segments like Flintstones Family Adventure, Captain Caveman, who made his return here, and Bedrock Cops, Fred and Barney as part-time cops. You could just imagine the situation these two would get in. This is Fred and Barney, for goodness sake. That's all to be said. Hanna-Barbera would make a lot of cartoons in the span of 1980 alone. Even cartoons based on Fonz from Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. In other words, any property they could make a cartoon off of, they would do it. They would also continue their adventures in first-run syndication with shows like the Hanna-Barbera World of Super Adventure, which housed various cartoons as well. Hanna-Barbera were on a roll. But besides Hanna-Barbera's World of Super Adventure, which we will see again momentarily, none of these shows would be huge hits for Hanna-Barbera. These were basically short affairs on NBC and ABC. Even into 1981, this would continue on. Until September 12th, 1981, Hanna-Barbera would give us a cartoon that would usher them in to the 80s with full steam. And behold, American audiences would be introduced to the one and only the Smurfs. Hanna-Barbera would jump into a territory they dipped their hands in before, the comic book license. Well, technically a comic strip. See, the Smurfs was actually the creation of Belgian cartoonist Pierre Culliford, but he would be known by his pen name Peo. Upon seeing a Belgian film based on the Smurfs, media entrepreneur Stuart R. Ross would acquire the rights to the Smurfs. He would soon usher in a line of toys based off the Smurfs. Now, remember when I mentioned Fred Silverman jumping ship to NBC a while ago? Well, this is where he would come into play here. See, one day, Fred had noticed that his daughter was playing with one of those Smurfs toys, and that's when inspiration hit him. He believed that the Smurfs could turn the tide for NBC. See, one thing to understand is that at the time, NBC actually wanted to get rid of their Saturday morning lineup. So, to make a long story short, Fred would acquire the license to the Smurfs, and it was greenlit as a last ditch effort to save NBC's Saturday morning cartoon lineup. Fred would also bring on Peyo as a script supervisor. Peyo would also be quite hands-on with the production of the series as well. The Smurfs would become an instant hit on NBC, and it's very easy to see why it became one. The Smurfs was very different from anything that had came from Hanna-Barbera up to this point. The Smurfs were quite interesting. They were little blue creatures that lived in the forest and got into adventures as they tried to escape the advances of the wizard Gargamel and his pet cat Azrael, who always tried to eat them. Speaking of the Smurfs, each of them were definitely individuals. For instance, there was Jokey Smurf, Vanity Smurf, Grouchy Smurf, Brainy Smurf, Hefty Smurf, and the only girl Smurf, Smurfette. Well, until Sassette would be introduced later in the series, which was voiced by the aforementioned Judy McWhirter, by the way. Told you she would come back into the fold. They were all led by the patriarch of the family, Papa Smurf. The Smurfs provided something rare to television. It was a cartoon that was easily accessible to both kids and adults. On top of that, since it was based off a comic and not merchandise, it allowed Hanna-Barbera's writers, along with Peyo, to craft something that Hanna-Barbera definitely wasn't known for, connecting storylines. This was a new venture for the studio, and it was one that paid off. It would dominate the Saturday morning ratings that year and became a hit on NBC and Saturday mornings entirely. But despite the success, Hanna-Barbera would have trouble keeping it on the air. In fact, according to Joe Barbera himself, he would have to fly to New York every year to see the head of NBC programming, Brandon Tartikoff, to save the show from being canceled. Speaking of every year, the Smurfs would last a whopping 9 seasons on the network for a total of 256 episodes. NBC would go down as the leader of something great and something disappointing in the span of those 10 years. But that's a story for another time. But in the context of this episode, the Smurfs would save NBC's Saturday morning cartoon lineup from getting the axe and would usher in a plethora of cartoons that would become successes for them as well. The Smurfs would become so big that it wouldn't only garner several Emmy nominations and winning one in 1982-83 for Outstanding Children's Entertainment Series, it would also get quite the accolade. It would be compared to The Cosby Show in primetime in a 1992 LA Times article. So it's definitely easy to say that the Smurfs were Hanna-Barbera's flagship cartoon for the 80s. The Smurfs' success would also bring about another cartoon at the time.
Come along with the Snorks. Swim along with the Snorks. So much to see waiting for you and me. Swim along with the, have some fun with the, come along with the Snorks.
The Snorks. This would come about when Freddie Von Nickendam, a Belgian businessman, wanted in on the action that the Smurfs had gotten on NBC. Long story short, him and Peyo had a falling out, and Freddie decided to find something else that could compete with the Smurfs. This would come into fruition when Freddie partnered with Nick Broca for the rights to a comic called Spirou et Fantastio. Freddie brought it to Hanna-Barbera, and in spirited fashion, the series was greenlit. The Snorks was very similar to the Smurfs. Sure, the setting was different. The Smurfs took place in a fantastical realm and lived in the forest, whereas the Snorks were creatures who resided underwater. Anyway, the Snorks were plankton-like creatures who adopted a society that was quite similar to ours. In other words, quite modern. They lived in Snorkland. The series had a wide cast of characters such as All-Star Seaworthy. Yes, they all had last names. Demi Finster, Kelsey Kelp, Daphne Gilfin, and Tudor Shelby, to name a few. They would fend off the villainous advances of Dr. Strange Snork, a mad scientist who often forgot his own name, and was also All-Star's uncle as well. Unfortunately for NBC and Freddie Mon Nickendam, the Snorks would never reach the level of success that the Smurfs had gotten. But the way I look at it, it was a marginal success. The Snorks lasted from 1984 to 1989, 4 seasons, 2 on NBC and 2 in syndication. Meanwhile, on ABC, Hanna-Barbera was still at it, making cartoons for Saturday mornings. Hanna-Barbera always knew a good thing when they seen it. In this case, I speak of Scrappy Doo. Scrappy Doo had become very popular with the audience at this point, and Hanna-Barbera, as usual, was quick to capitalize off that with the new Scooby-Doo and Scrappy show on September 10th, 1983. This iteration would bring back at least one of the original cast members, Daphne. It was an odd premise that actually had Shaggy and Daphne solving mysteries, which honestly, in the original series and the iterations before it, wasn't their strong suit. But Hanna-Barbera called the shots here. So, Shaggy and Daphne solving mysteries, along with Scooby and Scrappy Doo posing as team reporters for a teen magazine, it was. But the format and the name of the show would be changed to the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries a year later, and brought back Velma and Fred, so all was well. But this wouldn't stick around. ABC wouldn't quit on Scooby-Doo just yet, because on September 7th, 1985, ABC would deliver another incarnation of Scooby-Doo called The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. This one was very interesting. It would go back to the Shaggy, Scooby, Scrappy, and Daphne dynamic from the new Scooby-Doo and Scrappy show. Second, the show would feature real ghosts. Yes, whereas the Scooby-Doo and Scrappy Doo show would feature real monsters occasionally, this one flat out featured real ghosts. On top of that, another character would join the fold, a young boy by the name of Flim Flam. As for the premise, it was about Shaggy, Scooby-Doo, Scrappy Doo, and Daphne going on an expedition, and long story short, Scooby and Shaggy get tricked into opening an evil chest by 2 bubbling ghosts. This in turn released the ghost from this chest, and they had to find these ghosts and put them back in the chest before any catastrophic events happened. This was very different from every iteration before it, and was possibly the darkest incarnation of Scooby-Doo up to this point. And to further drive that macabre vibe, a man by the name of Vincent Van Gogh offered his assistance in recapturing the ghosts. Now, if he looks familiar, he should to any classic horror movie fan. It's Vincent Price, classic 1930s, 1940s movie star who famously was known for his roles in several horror films, such as The Invisible Man, the original House on Haunted Hill, and also he had TV roles such as playing Egghead in 7 episodes of the 1966 Batman TV series. And his famous role of all would be narrating the monologue for the classic Michael Jackson video Thriller. Speaking of Thriller, he was mostly famously known for his distinct voice. Hanna-Barbera basically made a character off of Vincent Price to celebrate their love for classic horror film. Talk about wearing your admiration on your sleeve. Nice touch. Even though Hanna-Barbera had a big name like Vincent Price behind this iteration of Scooby-Doo, this unfortunately wouldn't translate to good ratings. Scooby-Doo and the gang never got to finish trapping all 13 ghosts in the chest because the series would be canceled after only one season. The failed reception of the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo wasn't the only mishap Hanna-Barbera would suffer. See, despite Hanna-Barbera pumping out many cartoons during this time period, it wasn't actually them in full control of the projects. This is when they started to outsource a lot of their projects to various studios, including Toei Animation and Cuckoo's Nest Studios. Two studios that I must delve into. They both have quite interesting stories themselves. Anyway, this was due to the writer's strike of 1982, where everything had to be outsourced that year. This would open a can of worms that would last for a long time, especially throughout the 80s. This wasn't Hanna-Barbera's only problem though. Even though everything seemed to be going in their favor, something would happen behind the scenes at the studio. This would happen in 1987. Now, to understand what happened, first I must confess something. I totally left out a huge detail of their history. See, Hanna-Barbera didn't operate alone. They were actually under Toth Broadcasting Company. Toth had acquired the studio in 1966. Now, why is this important to the story? Well, in 1987, Toth would unfortunately lose ownership of Hanna-Barbera and several companies they had under their umbrella. The buyer? None other than a company called Great American Broadcasting. This is where things started to get interesting. Thank you all for watching. Hanna-Barbera was quite the studio, wasn't they? Unfortunately, this is why I decided to stop here. I really hope you are enjoying the content. Also, I would love to give a thanks to these people. And a special thanks to these people as well. With part 3, we will conclude on Hanna-Barbera's venture with American Broadcasting and beyond. What truly becomes of Hanna-Barbera? Find out on the next episode of the Cartoon Curator.